Welcome to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. This series features discourse on topics pertinent to the C-level conversation revolving the integration of artificial intelligence into the ever-evolving IT operations landscape. Discover trends and actionable tips for digital transformation, as well as the latest news on how AIOps is transforming business and government operations to create flow in their organization. And don't stay in the dark on the latest industry news. Join the AIOps Evolution community to stay connected and subscribe to the show at AIOpsevolution.com. Now, let's join our hosts, Sean McDermott and Bill Driscoll, IT thought leaders, visionaries, and the voices on the other end of the mic for the latest episode of AIOps Evolution Weekly.
Welcome, everybody, to the AIOps Evolution Weekly broadcast. My name is Sean McDermott, and my co-host, Bill. Bill, how are you doing on this Friday?
I'm good. I'm looking forward to another week in a row going up to New York. So just visit family.
That
So
sounds fun. Yeah,
the
I was in
month of
Boston last
out
weekend.
of town. Oh, good.
That's
Head north,
awesome.
right? Cooler weather.
Yeah. So, do you want to talk a little AIOps stuff before the weekend? Nothing
Sure,
like
that
starting the
sounds
weekend
good.
with a little
Before hitting the
AIOps.
road.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So we got a couple articles here, a couple of topic we want to talk about. So let's start off today with a Network World article came out really referring to an EMA study that basically said that EMA study found networking pros who reported the most success with AIOps pointed to improved security and compliance as a potential benefit. So this is a pretty interesting article. I think I say that every time. This is an interesting article. I guess we wouldn't be talking about it if I didn't find it interesting.
Yep.
But I think one of the things that was interesting to me about it is, and we'll get into it a little bit more, but just on the surface, a report found that 90% of the surveyed networking pros believe applying AIOps to network management can lead to better business outcomes and overall and for an overall enterprise. I found that interesting because that makes it sound like 90% of people are doing AIOps, and I don't think that's true. I think the vast majority of companies right now are, at least in my experience, are investigating AIOps as a potential solution for them. And so, is this a hope? Like 90% of people hope that this is what's going to turn out with AIOps.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think I do agree. 90% are at least looking at AIOps. They're evaluating it. We're talking to customers every week just about doing an assessment or doing some experimental things. And so, yeah, I'd say I agree with that 90%. I think 90% are definitely not in the middle of implementation of any kind of AIOps. That might be in the mid. We don't have numbers, but that could be 40, 50%. I would say.
Yeah, I think that in our clients, we're looking at probably 10 or 15% are actually actively in implementation of AIOps solutions and mostly AIOps monitoring platforms. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think we'll sort of see. I think we're going to talk a little bit later about the vendor landscape, but I think some companies that already have a vendor that's innovating or investing in sort of AIOps capabilities. I think they're definitely working with those vendors, and maybe they're doing it in a POV status, or maybe they're rolling it out to some extent. But I think the range of what we define as AIOps is pretty broad, and I think it boils down to a handful of things. And I think some vendors are doing some pieces of it, and other vendors are sort of trying to go all in and really be nothing but an AIOps platform. And I think it's probably a low percent that have invested in that, pure play, 100% AIOps platform that sort of bolts in and sort of fits with the rest of your ecosystem. I think it's more individual features that are machine learning like, or even maybe some machine learning that I think a lot of customers are looking at implementing right now.
Yeah, another part of this article, and we could have a whole discussion on this, and maybe we will in the future. They quoted one person, one of the surveys. We have so many tools and so many GUIs, and every single tool is doing just one thing. If a vendor had functionality where we could marry their solution with other tools and build AI around that, it would be useful. vendors should look for ways to consolidate panes of glass with other tools, either through acquisition or ingesting and sharing data.
Yeah.
So I've been doing this a long time, right? I started my company 25 years ago, and I was in operations before that. This is like literally the age old, as far as I've been, almost last 30 years, is best of breed versus platform plays, right? And we've seen
Hmm.
this story before of, do you go all in with CA? Do you go all in with BMC? Do you go all in with HP back in the day? To now it's like, do I go all in on ServiceNow? Do I go all in on Splunk? And so it's like the vendors have changed, the use
Hmm.
cases have changed, but the argument is still the same. And you could make arguments on either side that, well, are these large vendors who have to go wide in order to continue to drive the massive amount of revenues that they have? Do they start to innovate through acquisition, and
Yeah.
or do they actually continue to build and innovate internally on these technologies? In my experience over the last 20 years, a lot of these large vendors, they innovate through acquisition, including a company that I sold to BMC. And eventually, these tools they're written in different technologies, they're architected differently, and they start kind of trying to glue them together into a platform play. This kind of this full blown platform. But when you lift up the covers, it's still somewhat of an architectural mess underneath. So
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that? And I think we should have a whole discussion on this in the coming weeks.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's sort of that's a great segue to the next topic, which is
Hmm.
sort of the marketplace. But before I sort of go there, there was one last point I thought was interesting that was written on that, that Seamus McGillicuddy at Network World pointed out, which was a lot of organizations are looking at the tools that they have, and like you said, all these disparate tools, and looking at what are the gaps that we have in our tools, what's the inaccurate data, or what are we not getting in the tools, and kind of focusing from that point. I think a lot of vendors that we'll refer to are really looking at where's the puck going. So in hockey, you skate to where the puck's going. And I think what you really need to look at, what he recommends, is you got to look at your engineering, you got to look at your operations, you got to look at the technology that's coming and the infrastructure that's part of that, your software defined and network function virtualization and containers and the cloud, and say what is that infrastructure going to look like? What are those services going to look like? And what are our needs? And then start to build towards those needs, instead of just looking at your, backwards almost at the tools you have and what gaps you think you have, because filling those gaps may not get you where you're going. And
Yeah.
so, that sort of leads to this where's the marketplace going? And I think I'm not going to name any vendors because they're really emerging, coming out. But I've read articles just in the last couple of weeks from several that are really press releases, but they're providing some insights that are really trying to find gaps that the large vendors have, and figuring out how do we play, right? And all of their messaging is like, you don't need to replace anything. You just bring us in as an overlay, feed all this data in, and then we're going to give you the insights, where you have patented, unsupervised machine learning, or we have a patented, predictive algorithms, or patented anomaly detections. And by bringing all of this data back into our system, we're going to be able to kind of provide those insights, or we're going to be able to provide that sort of real time identification of where you really need to focus. And I think a lot of these vendors are going to be struggling with growth, going into a large enterprise, and the volume of the data, the disparity of the data. I think some of them will find are probably one-trick ponies, or maybe three-trick ponies. But it's going to shake out, and they're all sort of contributing to this growing market that really could double or triple in the next few years. And some of their innovations are going to die out, and some of them are going to, be acquired by the ServiceNows and the Splunks and the IBMs and whatnot.
Yeah, I
So what's
think,
your thought?
having gone through this, right? What you're going to find is that a lot of these products that are emerging really aren't products; they're more features, and
Mm-hmm.
that those features
Yeah.
will ultimately be acquired. Those companies will be acquired for those particular features, and I think that's a very common thing. The other thing I think that we need to keep in check here is, the companies that are looking at AI ops, the companies that are always really on the bleeding edge of adoption are usually the largest enterprises that have the largest issues around scale. And we're seeing it right now with AI ops and these large enterprises that are just creating massive amounts of data and have to start employing AI technology to process it for all the use cases that I think we're going to talk about in a little bit. But a lot of these products, when they come to market, I don't know if they're exactly, and in my experience, geared, ready for the enterprise, right? They're kind of ready for mid-level enterprises, and then they go into these large enterprises and they kind of just get clobbered. So we'll see how that shakes out. I think you're right. There's just a lot of vendors coming out. I'll do a little bit of a shameless plug right now. The AIOps Evolution podcast, which we released season 1, it's out. We're actually in production right now of season 2, and in season 2, we're actually focusing very much on the vendors, and we're bringing in every single vendor that we, kind of the top 12 or 14 vendors. We're still formulating the number. And we're interviewing each one of these vendors and giving them a chance to kind of talk about their vision, what they're doing with their product, what they see as where AI ops is going, where they're meeting AI ops, what their differentiators are. So I think that's going to be a really useful podcast for people that are thinking about AI ops and trying to sort through some of this vendor technology. But for this broadcast, we don't really want to kind of go too much into vendors and give plugs and things like that. But any other final thoughts on that?
The one final thought is, I think you brought up the point that a lot of these newer products are features. I think they're contributing, they're disrupting, right? But they'll name big time, companies we've all heard of, Fortune 100 companies that are their customers. But when you drill in, they really found a specific use case. They're all trying to wedge themselves in and say, for this new business unit, this new 5G or edge or containers or Docker, they're really just laser focused on that, trying to get in and wedge themselves in and solve that use case. And they hope, they'll continue to innovate and grow. And I do think from a company standpoint, an enterprise standpoint, that is the place you want to start to innovate and experiment and try out some of these vendors that are bringing in some things that you're not going to see from the big vendors for probably a few years out.
Yeah. The one thing I tell my clients, right, is, and we say this all the time, AI ops is a strategy, right? It's not a technology. It's not a platform. And you have to look at it over a multi-year. So you have to have a vision of what you're trying to do. You have to have a starting point. You have to think about starting small and how you're going to build momentum through AI ops use cases and kind of knocking them off one by one while people get involved, because there's so much. There's a lot of myths around AI ops too, right? That need to get dispelled through that process, and we're just in the beginning. I think that actually is a good lead into our final topic, and really the AI ops, the history, uses, and future of AI ops. So, article written by James McGuire of eWeek. So this one kind of caught my eye. It's an interesting article in that it goes a little bit into the history and a little bit into the future and some of the current use cases right now. I actually wholeheartedly agree with pretty much everything in this article. And they talk a little bit about AI ops and where the term came from. It was actually coined from Gartner, which is interesting because we work with a number of analysts, and they're all kind of trying to take their own spin on AI ops because they don't want to call it AI ops to give a competitor like Gartner kudos. But in the end, AI ops was coined by Gartner, and that's what everybody's calling it. And it gets a little confusing when other analysts use other terms. You're like, well, what does that mean? And they're like, it means AI ops. So like, oh, okay, great. Talked a little bit about some of the use cases. One of the chief product officer from BMC talked about some of the use cases. He outlined 5 use cases. I think those are dead on. We'll talk about those in a second. And then essentially, what are the 2 shifts of AI ops coming in the future? So, what are your thoughts on? I know you read this article. What are your thoughts on it? And initially, and I think we talked ad nauseum about why AI ops is even a thing, right? And the processing of data and data streams and massive amounts of data. I don't think we need to get into that too much, but I think it's interesting that kind of talking about the use cases that the chief product officer from BMC brought up. What are your thoughts on that? Why don't you outline these use cases and give me your thoughts on that?
Okay. I'll actually, you know what? I don't have the article in front of me just to look at what those use cases are.
Oh, okay. All right.
But,
Then I will take
if you have them in front of you, why don't you do that? I had some thoughts
I do have them
I
in
wanted
front of
to
me.
share. But I agree with you. Before you do that, I agree with you. It was a very well-written article, and I think I like the combination of pragmatism, where things are going and kind of real use cases, but he also gets pretty philosophical about sort of, the nature and where technology is going as a whole and complexity, and really simple things that are getting solved. They seem simple on the surface, but you compound them and it creates just massive amounts of complexity. So I'll leave it at that. Like I said, we've talked about kind of the why of AIOps, but I like the way you explain some of that. But to some of the use cases, you want to go through those?
Yeah. So these are use cases that you work on a daily basis. So and again, as we talk about the beginning of AI ops and why we were even talking about it, it's about processing mass amounts of data. So when you get into the operations world, what are the areas that process mass amounts of data? And it's monitoring, right? Monitoring is really the kind of the primary area that just creates tons of data, whether it's monitoring infrastructure, monitoring applications, monitoring containers and microservices and things like that. So the 5 use cases he talked about were predictive alerting, root cause analysis, prioritization of events, predictive outages, and service desk ticketing, which is kind of funny, right? Because again, we've been around the block for a while, and I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can remember literally having conversations in the early 2000s, with people and working with them on tools like Micromuse and HP OpenView, saying, hey, this is all about root cause analysis, right? And this is about prioritizing events and using this data from Micromuse to do predictive analysis. I mean, that was literally the story 20 years ago, right? Same exact use cases. The use cases haven't changed, but now we're applying AI to it.
Right. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I did HP OpenView back 20 years ago, and then IBM's topology that came out of Micromuse, and before that Riversoft. So I've implemented those at some large telecoms, banks, a medical, pharmaceutical or medical facility. And I think, the big thing that HP did was downstream suppression, right? And it was like, we figured out downstream suppression. All those pings, you don't have to, ping failures, you don't have to worry about because we figured out where it is. We've solved root cause analysis. And it's like, not really. There's, networks are being configured at the layer more complex. And then Riversoft, which was Micromuse, and then IBM came along and they figured out how to build a model that looked at connectivity and relationships and more the containers. It isn't just a router, it's a router of modules or it's VLANs, and there's a whole hierarchy in there. And they figured out how to get suppression that way and became, all right, we've solved root cause analysis. And now in today's world, you've got multi-cloud and containers and virtual machines that go up and down. And so the world of problems to solve has become so much bigger. And today's method is, let's just enrich it with lots of information, and we'll look at the textual content of alerts and look for patterns there. And I think this is just one step in that evolution, right? As far as all the different algorithms, in machine learning that are going to start to be applied and kind of be brought to the forefront of how you solve these problems. But yeah, those 5 use cases you just mentioned, I didn't note them down because they're really the same 5 use cases that we've been seeing for 20 years, right? I think that's kind of a known, right?
Yeah, kind of a funny story is that when I founded a company called RealOps back in 2004, and it was the first runbook automation platform on the market. And I remember when we were raising money and talking to investors, and a lot of the investors, one particular group who actually ended up investing in us basically said, hey, I was doing this a long time ago. Like, they haven't solved this problem. Like, that was literally like
Yeah,
17
right.
years ago. So, the use cases are exactly the same. It's just that the infrastructure is just getting so much more complex, right? And I kind of laugh about the use cases not changing, but in the end, that's really what operations is all about. It's except that the infrastructure that we're managing 15 years ago, when you had um, switches connected to routers, connected to and servers connected to a switch, it was more straightforward. Now you've got, like you said, cloud services, you've got virtualization, you've got instances coming up and coming down. So your topology is almost changing instantaneously. And you've got all these new layers of software components that are all kicking off information. It's just harder and harder. So, last thing before we kind of head out for the weekend, the last part of the article, which I thought was really about the future, right? Two shifts in AIOps. One about AI will exponentially increase, which we kind of mentioned before. We're just in the beginning throes of this, and I think that 3 years from now we're going to see very different things going on in AIOps. And the other thing is AIOps meaning is going to change. I think where I stand on this thing is I think that the concept of AIOps, if you're thinking about it as a monitoring platform, yes, AIOps is going to change. The meaning is going to change. When you think about AIOps as a strategy, as we do, then I don't know if the meaning changes. You just accept the fact that AI is going to start embedding into all kinds of different parts of your infrastructure and your management systems, whether it be virtual chatbots like ServiceNow is working on now, and we talked about last week, embedded AI into hardware platforms, embedded right into chips of the servers and things like that. I think that's going to change, which basically goes back to shift one, that it's going to accelerate, very, very fast.
Right. Yeah, I'll make a couple comments on what he said about the future. I'll quote him. He said he sort of used AI for IT operations, which is what AIOps stands for now, to just becoming more broadly AI operations and becoming, and I'll quote, a single all-encompassing AI system that doesn't just help monitor IT operations, but also forecast business spending, employee retention rates, analyze the success of marketing campaigns. So he really makes a pretty bold step and says this AI that we're kind of focusing on IT operations, as well as the AI and all these other problem areas, are all going to converge. And I think we kind of touched on that last week, in that I had said, that the AI ops or IT operations people should be looking into the rest of the CIO organization. The other thing he mentioned is just the convergence of AI ops and robotic process automation. And I think my big takeaway there was really, I think people have to get really good, and our customers and we as well, at defining problems very well. And I think as you define those problems you're trying to solve very well, I think then you start to educate yourself on machine learning and AI, and what's the level, or what's the algorithm, or what's the approach to solve those problems. Because I think you don't just apply AI or robotic process automation in a blind way to the problems. You really got to understand the problem that you're facing and what's the best use of technology to solve it. So.
Well, I think that wraps up this week, and I appreciate your time. I hope you have a great weekend. I hope everybody watching has a great weekend and gets some time off. And we appreciate you guys listening in. I wanted to thank our sponsor, Windward Consulting Group, the #1 global leader in AI ops, for sponsoring this broadcast. And we will see you next week. Thanks, Bill. Have a great weekend.
Great. All right. See you, Sean. See you next week.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation about AIOps and the future of IT operations. Interested in a deeper dive on these topics? Check out our resources available at AIOpsevolution.com. And remember to subscribe to get the latest episode.